Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Dreux fought on December the 19th, 1562, a pivotal clash in the French Wars of Religion. We made a video about them last year, and we're going to increase the content on this history of warfare chapter that is being somehow obscured compared to other ones, but we're looking at very big clashes, big sieges in particular. The Battle of Dreux is actually a pitched clash. However, it's quite relevant in an age which actually armies were not so enormous as one may think, considering at least the name that the Renaissance would have allegedly, in fact, compared to the Middle Ages. I also made some videos explaining how actually small Renaissance armies were compared even probably to the peak of medieval civilization. This battle is quite important because I will spoiler the outcome, but you're habituated to this. The Catholic forces under the Duke of Guise narrowly defeated the Huguenot army led by the Prince of Condé. Actually, Coligny, as we will see now, but these were partially aristocratic coalition forces of some degree. We'll offer some political background, marking a bloody escalation, by the way, in the struggle between the two religious factions. I'm glad, again, to discuss the battle once again, because we haven't done it so much for the modern age, right? I've been experimenting this. Normally for the medieval ones, I browse every single primary source within the same video. When you start entering modern age, there is so much that it's a bit difficult to simply do so in a single video just for the sake of also the reconstruction of a battle that tendentially has been more studied, right? I always suspect that there is a huge vacuum in historiography as far as battle reconstruction is concerned. I am a medievalist, I'm not a modernist. I do not know, say, the depths of especially primary source historiography and scholarly connections with them. In any case, there is always room for further research in these battles, and with some work you can definitely sort out what happened. I also note that, unsurprisingly, nobody has ever made a video about the Battle of Dreux on YouTube. There are just some war game simulations that are quite nice. There's a video game even, but nobody of the bigger channels making a video about the actual clash. So this is, again, embarrassingly normal, unfortunately, showing how sort of properly out of any cultural dimension YouTube is as a whole. On Schwerpunkt, we cover in depth, step by step, every single chapter in the history of the art of war. And so here we go, right? I gave you already, again, in that video about the French Wars of Religion, a quite sort of wide tapestry of contextual information. We'll come back on that. I have a video that I made, not much on request, but seconding a request about Henry IV of Navarre. In any case, the Battle of Dreux background, so to say. In the spring of 1562, the French Wars of Religion had erupted, this following the famous massacre of Vassy in March, which provoked an immediate Huguenot uprising. Protestant forces on this occasion had seized numerous cities, chiefly in southern France, because the core lands of the French crown in the northeast, the more developed, the historically more powerful, would remain staunchly and granitically Catholic throughout the entire war, which is also the same reason why Henry IV of Bourbon will have to eventually, pass literally to the Catholic side while having essentially championed the Protestant cause before in order to be King of France, famously enough. Paris is well worth a mass. And the entire war, in a sense, we've seen was naturally a pretty dangerous display of political violence, of great mass movements. There were deep reasons behind also this geographical distribution of the Protestant heresy in France. I made some videos also about the general context here of French generals, the ones even up to Louis XIII, the son of Henry IV, regarding their experience abroad. For example, in the 80 Years' War, there were lots of French Huguenots. I mean, Huguenots are French in any case, but French Calvinists fighting in the Netherlands, right? Gaining some important experience and developing also some ideas that we criticize as this in the historiographical sort of fabrication. Starting at the time with an incredibly effective and in this sense extremely respectable Protestant propaganda regarding the idea that the Protestant, which was however unfortunately embraced by later historiography of different Protestant countries much later these events, that there was something specifically advanced about Protestant warfare at this point. Right, and we made abundant videos on the Dutch army of Maurice of Nassau, and the same one of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. There are at least some aspects, especially in the latter, the latter was really like something in the history of the art of war, but even there, properly, not much overrated per se, but in relation to the Catholic forces, to the imperial ones, to the Spanish, to the Holy Imperial one proper. That, again, I described in different videos. I'm not going to repeat myself, but here we're also, in fact, getting a bit out of the picture. What is important here is that southern France, Occitania, actually, not proper France in this sense, had always been tendentially intolerant of the French domination, occupation, Francization, so to say, of the country. It had remained historically more disarticulated, also in a political, institutional way, and therefore there was a lot of malcontent that in the age of Reformation witnessed to the spread of, in fact, the Calvinist heresy, especially in southern France. Yeah, I don't have a map, but again, in the previous video about the French wars of religion, everything is very sort of visually clear. Also, if you look at these boundaries, they're very old ones. They're the ones of the Cathars back in the 13th century. And in general, in this sense, it's not like the Huguenots were the favorite ones. Most of this game was played at a nobiliar level. So at the level of the quite prolific Capetian house, we can't call them the Valois, the Bourbon. These are only branches of the older Capetian kings. Why? Because it was believed that, of course, if you swapped candidate on the throne, you could, and he was championing this or that a confession, there could be some sort of greater, if anything, autonomy. Anything about the Edict of Nantes, I don't know how many tens of times they were issued and revoked. The last time for good by Louis XIV, the Sun King. And there is a lot of Protestant history. It was a military history of, for example, also the Valdensians that were not Calvinists, but in a sense embraced this broader heretical resistance from Savoy, for example, in a quite difficult terrain. Here things were much more in the open. There wasn't, and this is what the whole history will prove, there wasn't much of a chance that Protestantism had in a country like France. Technically, even Francis I had been toying initially with the idea of converting to Protestantism. It was a political option on the table. This was especially the case for countering the Catholic Habsburgs to sort of take a harsher stance against the papacy and maybe with a impious fedus and the Turkish alliance. But things had remained safely Catholic for different reasons that I also explain in different videos about properly the imperial Catholic traditional nature of Frankish identity, right? In any case, in fact, the Huguenots immediately in 1562 found significant difficulties in Guyenne. That was yet another historical area, of course, always siding with the English that will actually intervene, just like they had been doing since ever. Think about the 100 Years' War. And this area was quite easily accessible from the Atlantic, had some important sort of resources with the Garonne basin, etc. And there, in fact, the Huguenots found a rallying point. However, just like in other dynamics of French history, we've seen really the Battle of Taillebourg, we have seen sort of so much, also just recently, the same identical places where these clashes were fought. The Huguenot effort faltered with Catholic victories at Poitiers, which also is literally yet another famous battle of the 100 Years' War, and now the seat of a Catholic victory over the Huguenots. Bourges, Targon, we are in July, we are in the full season, and therefore the Catholic crown can display its full might accordingly. You have Vert in October as well, so the season is closing, but the Huguenots resist. Right, the Catholics in this campaign are led by Marshal Jacques d'Albon de Saint-André. We will see also in the Battle of Dreux what his role will be. Amid escalating tensions, the Catholic triumvirate of the time, comprising Anne de Montmorency, Constable of France, the same Saint-André, that was a former favorite of King Henry II and Marshal of France. So we're looking at some of the top offices of probably interior, also military ones. Here there was also some political favoritism. You didn't necessarily have to have a stellar military curriculum to get there, but still with an enormous power, enormous clienteles and political reach. And François de Guise, the Duke of Guise, that as a triumvirate had seized control of the royal family under the regency of Catherine de' Medici. Anne de Montmorency was a seasoned noble with decades of military service under Francis I and Henry II. He was, at this point, leveraging his position as Constable of France to dominate royal policy, though his conservative tactics often clashed with younger commanders. As you know, the House of Montmorency was the crème de la crème of the French nobiliar elite since ever. I think their house dates back to the 10th century or something. We can make a video about them, by the way. Saint-André had been elevated to Marshal in 1554 for his loyalty to Henry II. He, however, lacked extensive battlefield experience, yet withheld significant influence through court favoritism as well. It was important to have him in the army. Finally, François de Guise, a charismatic and skilled general from the powerful Guise family, was a staunch Catholic, to say the least, whose ambition to control the regency fueled tensions with Catherine de' Medici, that was trying to maintain some greater balance. Essentially, the Guise, also we've seen with the assassination of Henri, that was the son of François, was, the son was assassinated in 68 by King Henry III. It was the greatest facepalm probably in French political history, especially in this quite delicate balance of the wars of religion. In fact, Catherine de' Medici, Henry's mother, sort of eventually died just out of of heartbreak because of the collapse of in fact, the same Henry III will switch paradoxically to the Protestants at that point and got assassinated later. And this house was actually not even historically French. They came from the Holy Roman Empire, at least they were Francophones in any case. And for this reason, they felt more zealotically rampant, right? They had understood just espousing the Catholic cause. They could essentially look more, legitimate than the same monarchy that was trying their very best, although, of course, supporting the Catholic cause, not especially to have the situation further escalate, for a very simple reason. There was no money, right? So every single uprising could undermine the kingdom as a whole more than, giving something to the Protestants that fundamentally, it's a very interesting sort of political and social dynamic. They had essentially some cities, some safe havens of some sort. The entire population was quite sort of divided between these confessions in many areas. And in fact, great part of the massacres that occurred during the French War of Religion occurred due to the fact that the communities were very close to one another. And these ups and downs, let's say, of both sides during the war, because the victory of this and of the other at alternate points, brought to literally like the wind. This is very characteristic of French history and politics, like the political wind changing suddenly as a tidal wave from one side or another, with all the bath of blood that in any case at the end did manage to stabilize the great Catholic French power, though at some cost, there is no doubt. The triumvirate, so to say, aggressive maneuvers, including the capture of Rouen in the lower Seine River in Normandy in October, compelled the Huguenots to respond accordingly, to put a threat especially in the same north. In fact, Dreux is not Normandy, but it belongs to the homonymous county, perhaps. I don't remember whether I already made a video about the county of Dreux. No, but okay, it's one of those that we have to cover for sure. And given the Protestant position as we'll see now, in the campaign, it was quite important to intervene in Normandy, because that was an important lifeline also as far as the contact with England were concerned. As always, again, same very familiar dynamics if you're just familiar with, say, I don't know, the 100 Years' War, the Angevin period, and so on. Now, the Huguenots were led by Louis I, the Prince of Condé, and the Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. They were actively seeking foreign support, as we just observed, securing, in fact, English aid with a force landing at Le Havre on the Channel and recruiting German mercenaries, including 4,000 to 5,000 Landsknechte and 2,500 Reiters, though they failed to enlist Swiss troops loyal to the Catholics since 1516, a loyalty cemented by the Perpetual Peace Treaty of that year, which bound Swiss cantons to provide military service to the French crown in exchange for economic privileges. And this is obviously quite fascinating, because it shows you from one side how permeable 16th century countries were to properly mercenary warbands still at this point, especially in a time of war, political upheaval, etc. How intense the contacts were with sort of different communities, due also to confessional bondage. The Landsknechten didn't necessarily have to be Protestant, but many of them were, even though they were born, as we've explained also in a dedicated video, as imperial militia. And as you know, the same soldiers of Charles V ended up looting Rome, also as Lutherans earlier in the century. It's not like the Spaniards were tender with the Romans compared to their heretical counterparts, as a matter of fact. The Swiss had historically, I made a specific video about the properly native French, properly national French infantry during the Italian wars. That is a bit of a niche topic, given that, in fact, we will talk about this better. The Swiss had historically constituted the infantry of the French armies throughout the war. Right, the French, given their feudal, chivalric, aristocratic, nobiliar ethos and their entire structure as a country, had also sensibly understood that arming large amounts of footmen with pikes, could be quite a threat to the knightly establishment. They actually lost the Italian wars, likely because the French had the greatest manpower, like demographic agricultural resources. Had they unlocked that through some infantry sort of reform, they would have probably beaten the Spanish even in Italy. So we see this interesting melange, this interesting practice. We'll see how the Landsknechten and the Reisläufer, they hated each other, notoriously. The Germans and the Swiss behaved on the various sides of the battlefield. They were telling the truth, kind of both from both sides, but prevalently the Protestants here had the Landsknecht, and also just for monetary reasons, not because they were necessarily heretical, and the Swiss, and surely they were also Lutheran and Calvinists from the Catholic side. Again, completely normal. Also, the armies of, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had Catholics, including, as you know, also the Celts of Scotland, of Ireland, in their armies. It was not much of a problem per se. If anything, we'll come back on the 30 Years' War, because it's a long time that we don't discuss it. As far as pike-and-shot warfare, I mean, we all know what we're talking about. Hopefully so. After the videos about Schola Gladiatoria, I realized many people that follow history do not necessarily follow, the art of war as such. I made plenty of videos on this, but we will have a wide opportunity today to look at an actual battle. So how this almost but not quite paper scissors stone system worked like. Both sides had pikemen, fundamentally still the majority at this time, gunners. Consider that this is also a relatively conventional clash. Like if when you look, for example, at also the 80 Years' War, later a bit the English Civil War. Well, okay, there's the 30 Years' War that escalated to a great deal of conventional warfare. But here we're looking at French versus French with pretty sizable forces. We'll see now in the tens of thousands. You've heard here of the various contingents. The Reiter were notoriously those German style, and in this case probably German mercenary cavalry trained in the Spanish-derived term of this tactics, the caracol, the snail, because they essentially skirmished continuously with their will-lock pistols that basically the German sort of clock workers were quite skilled in creating in the 16th century. Germany and Italy were the most technologically advanced countries at the time for facilitating the reload, essentially a rank advance shot at close distance onto the enemy pikemen and withdrew to the posterior ranks of the column, and they reloaded and sort of repeated this until they literally threw their pistols on the head, in spite of the fact that were extremely costly of the pikemen, and if viable, they would pass properly to, as always cavalry does at the end of the day, to cold steel and charge into the infantry. And as we will see, this item will be meaningful during this battle. Louis I, Prince of Condé, was a Bourbon prince and fervent Protestant, emerging as a Huguenot leader after converting in 1558. Using his royal blood to rally noble support despite limited military experience, Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France since 1552, brought naval expertise and strategic acumen from campaigns against Spain, making him a linchpin of Protestant military force. Also, as we've seen from a logistical point of view, naval warfare, like connecting with the English across the Channel, the Atlantic, to get supply against the bigger royal power. By mid-November, the Protestant army, lacking sufficient numbers to besiege Paris, because they were sort of circling around like vultures trying to take over the bigger city, to also commit all kind of atrocities, by the way. The Catholics had more chances to exterminate Protestants during the French Wars of Religion, but it's not like the Protestants, were of a different mold. Actually, were even worse. This can be debated in this context, but still, right, there is no doubt about their intentions. And therefore, the Protestants launched attacks on the suburbs of Paris, but were forced to withdraw due to the threat of a Catholic counterattack from a very solid position, defensively speaking. On December 16th at Ablis, Condé and Coligny, facing logistical constraints and internal disagreements over strategy, which is never good really at a command level, decided to march north toward Le Havre to access English funds for their German mercenaries that cost a freaking lot, because there were many also. They had a great sort of collective training. There were military professionals, and also a bit, as we'll see during the battle, the only kind of solid infantry that the Protestants had in this campaign. This move towards the sea was hampered by desertion and indiscipline within the Protestant ranks, exacerbated by unpaid wages and the Huguenots' reliance on irregular levies from local Protestant communities in lieu, in fact, of some more consistent soldiery. as we will see, the Catholics had sort of better professional, sort of national infantry at this point, obviously was more easily participating to a civil war that threatened the same monarchy, and therefore could be militarily fielded regardless of some concern. The art of war is changing as well. Of course, cavalry at this point is reduced not to a minimum, as we will see. In fact, this battle shows a pretty intense cavalry use. In fact, the idea that with pike-and-shot warfare, cavalry almost eclipsed from the battlefield and sort of was not properly intended for its sort of unique shock function is not quite correct. And especially in a country like France that, as we explained, was very feudal, did not really have yet properly a modern national army, like only during the Sun King, and which army will become. Strategically, the Catholic army, better informed of their enemies' movements through local Catholic networks, most of the north was Catholic, and intercepted correspondence, positioned itself to intercept the Huguenots on their way to the Channel. On the night of December the 18th, Montmorency moved his forces across the river Our, establishing a defensible position between the Bois de la Marmousse, so the forest of La Marmousse, and the Bois de la Place. So, with covered flanks by the woods, we're south of Dreux, geographically speaking, to properly block the Protestant advance by intercepting the enemy host. The Catholic army, here we get to the numbers, counted approximately 18 to 20,000 men, including 2,500 cavalry and 16 to 20,000 infantry. Here, as I was saying before, if we were to read the sources about whichever number is said here, there, well, we wouldn't end the video ever, but consistently, this is what we think they were. And the Catholic host was composed of diverse units, 36 companies of heavy cavalry, gendarmes. So these were the equivalent of the old men-at-arms, right? Just a bit more implement, so to say, and in a even heavier aristocratic French sauce. These are cavalrymen, by the way. 22 ensignes of Gascon infantry, which is interesting because there were Catholic Gascons that served faithfully in the royal army. 17 ensigns of Breton and Picard infantry, 6,000 Swiss infantry organized in a tight pike and shot at this point in their history formation. I explained this because the Swiss, especially during the Italian wars, passed as just infantry, and just pikemen, and they technically were by that point, just a bit of halberds, volves, and so on. But as I explained in my video properly about the history of the Swiss army up to the 18th century, of course at this point the Swiss had been updating to pike-and-shot tactics, which, as we've seen, had been basically also the reason why they had been knocked out of the international game during the Italian wars after massive bloodbaths like the one of Marignano and so on. But as we will see, these guys are pretty good, right? Then there were also from the Catholic side 4,000 German Landsknechten and 2,000 Spanish troops as well, including a tercio equipped with advanced arquebuses and muskets. Spanish infantry was top-notch at the time. The Spanish had the strongest army of the era in Europe, and as such, they also were quite praised. Of course, they were a bit like any professional and quite proud, motivated force at large in these clashes. They would have performed like other sort of equal level infantry, telling the truth, but they were quite useful for the French at this point. Montmorency, despite his advanced age and questionable competence, assumed overall command of the Catholic army for political reasons, as his status as constable outranked other noblemen with Guise, the more capable general, as we've seen, deferring to him and leading a small reserve of 200-300 horsemen, including his personal company and gentlemen volunteers, positioned behind Saint-André's wing. This aspect is interesting because, of course, the reserve has always some strategically crucial relevance, as we've seen from the Frankrieg as well. They're fresh troops that can even knock out much larger ones, as long as, in fact, the latter are worn out instead. However, 200 and 300 in a battle of tens of thousands may have not, especially considering that this was mostly cavalry, and also pretty good one, because as we've seen, there was Guise's retinue, right? So these were some of the best knights in France, is relatively contained. Guise's deference stemmed from his strategic focus on consolidating Guise's family influence, balancing military leadership with political maneuvering to counter Montmorency's dominance. The Catholic deployment deviated from the traditional three-corps formation, opting for a single line spanning over 2 kilometers between Épinay and Blainville, a decision influenced by the terrain's narrow confines, as we've seen on the flanks, and the need to maximize artillery coverage. This aspect is also fascinating. As we've seen during the pike-and-shot era, the internal subdivision, what we call as sort of the squares, or at least the whole army composed of squares, actually followed the traditional segmentation of the entire host into 3 distinct battle lines deployed in depth, which is nothing else but what already seen at the peak of medieval civilization. Naturally, these are mostly infantrymen. So what happens in the second half of the 16th century, I made a video specifically about these 50 years in the Western art of war, of pike and shot, is that there is an increasing fluidification after probably the peak of infantry power over cavalry because of the combined armed tactics of pike and shot, of some, with some increasing importance of cavalry as well. Why? Because the pike was gradually, only slightly decaying, obviously remaining dominant. But as this deployment at Dreux shows, there was also a concomitant increase in firepower, and therefore to have a wider line. But this is also why, linear tactics are literally the ones that developed in the 18th century, because it was all about firepower. So if you didn't render it immediately available, it didn't make much sense to sort of wait for each line to be defeated in detail and not having your fire as opposed to the melee like in this era available. But you see in the second half of the 16th century, like in this case, some increase actually in firepower and opportunities to use it. Right, it's still a very typical pike and shot era battle, but cavalry is also quite relevant. We will see it all well now. Montmorency commanded the left wing, or corps de bataille, with 18 companies of gendarmes, 8 companies of chevaux légers under Louis, the Lord of Sansac, 20 ensigns of Picard and Breton legionnaires, which essentially were infantrymen, and 28 ensigns of Swiss infantry supported by 8 guns of varying caliber, including culverins and falconets. Louis, the Lord of Sansac, was a veteran of the Italian campaigns, a loyal Montmorency ally whose light cavalry expertise shaped the Catholic skirmishing tactics. Saint-André led the right wing, or avant-garde, with 3 companies of gendarmes under Henri, the Lord of Dameville, and Claude, the Duke of Aumale, 10 ensigns of Landsknecht, and 12 additional companies of gendarmes, and 20 ensigns of Piedmontese, and 14 of Spanish infantry, deployed slightly behind due to the wooden terrain, which hindered their maneuverability. All right. If you're interested also in the Piedmontese infantry, there is something about that in the video about the French, so to say, in fact, national infantry of the Italian wars, because some units were mixed and drawn, in fact, also from Savoy-Piedmont at some point. Henri, the Lord of Danville, was Montmorency's own son, and Claude, the Duke of Aumale, was a Guise relative. You realize that these were essentially young noblemen whose appointments reflected family ties rather than proven military prowess, that, however, was to be gained exactly in such circumstances, highlighting the triumvirate's nepotistic command structure, but also the pretty bloodily consistent nobiliar predisposition to a martial life and military exploit as a raison d'être in the age of Renaissance. We made some videos about, for example, also Montaigne's reflection on probably the role of the nobility during this very year. Here, I will see that there are actually famous characters in this battle. We'll explain later a bit of who they are. 14 additional guns, primarily heavy cannons, were placed before Épinay, protected by the so-called enfants perdus, that is to say, detached arquebusiers, tasked with some sort of skirmishing, in fact, vanguard role to disrupt enemy formation, but very much exposed. So the lost infants, the lost children, a bit like the Doppel-Söldner, the forlorn hope, picked units that had to expose themselves, but more in that case, mostly as heavy infantrymen. Now, passing to the Huguenot army, totaling 13,000 men, essentially split between 4,000 to 5,000 cavalry and 8,000 to 9,000 infantry, was less experienced than the royal one, particularly in infantry, and relied heavily on its superior cavalry. This much, as we will see, is true. Also, in fact, vowing them to some kind of offensive plan, both strategically and tactically at this point, because they had to break. Essentially, the battle was fought with the Protestants trying to break through both the strategic and the tactical block that the enemies had provided them in open field. This cavalry included battle-hardened German Reiter, armed with the aforementioned wheel-lock pistols. Condé's wing facing Saint-André consisted of 6 cornets of German Reiter in 2 units, 3 units of gendarmes, that is 150, 80, and 60 lances, each lance comprising a nobleman and 2 retainers. So these are robust nobiliar forces. 6 cornets of mounted arquebusiers, the so-called argoulets. So this is a very interesting type of unit. There is something similar also at the Scottish border in Britain, but here they're literally wielding arquebuses from horseback, which is something a bit equilibristically demanding to do, especially considering that these units were primarily equipped for skirmishing. A regiment of 6 ensigns of Landsknechten and 12 ensigns of French infantry drawn from Protestant strongholds like La Rochelle. And as we will see also during the battle, the Protestant infantry, mercenaries and levies were not that motivated, if anything. Coligny's wing, opposing Montmorency, featured 4 cornets of Reiter in 2 deep columns, which had to evidently enact that caracole tactic of sort of wearing out the enemy lines to eventually break through them with properly heavy force. 120 lances of gendarmes, approximately 300 men, then a second line with another regiment of Reiter, 6 ensigns of Landsknechten, and 11 ensigns of southern French infantry, primarily from Languedoc, these are the Occitanians, with 5 light guns, mostly falconets, positioned before the French foot for harassing fire. As you understand, there isn't a great deal of artillery power here, but there is an important amount of skirmishing, firepower also mounted. A small reserve of Lancers under François, the Count of La Rochefoucauld, supported Condé. François, the Count de la Rochefoucauld, was a prominent Huguenot noble from a family with deep Protestant ties, bringing regional influence and rallying southwestern levies, though his limited command experience strained coordination. The Huguenots' march lacked discipline, and their failure to conduct adequate reconnaissance on the terrain at Dreux, due to limited local support and over-reliance on outdated intelligence, left them unaware of the Catholic position, while Coligny's belief that the Catholics would avoid battle in the open, cavalry-favorable terrain of the plain between Neusemont, Épinay, Blainville, Montmousset, in Bernay and Marleville led to confusion in their battle line, as their troops were strung out in a marching column rather than a cohesive formation just before battle. As we will see also, this engagement shows us how balanced the odds actually were. You always have to juggle with the strategical dimension and the tactical one. Everything is basically the result of the other. And the point here is that even though the Protestants were less and less organized, they had quite some desperate sense of either we break through or we're going to really to suffer in a quite considerable fashion, both politically and strategically. And so they also, given the composition of their forces that had been sort of organized in view of this kind of encounters, had to break through. Cavalry here is the primary weapon on which the Protestants invest. And as we will see, they will almost manage to win. There is probably a critical point where the tide could turn in favor of the Protestants till the end of the day, even of the main engagement, as we will see better. So let's pass to the engagement. On the morning of December the 19th, 1562, the armies faced each other from 10 a.m. to noon, hesitating to engage. Contemporary accounts such as François de Lannoy's Discours, I talked about de Lannoy as far as probably the modernization, so to say, of military thought in this era, suggest this delay stemmed from reluctance to shed kinsmen's blood in the first major clash between French armies in basically over a century. Right? We have to look back at the revolts stemming from the attempt at French recompaction. We've seen this especially at the time of Charles VII, Louis XI, after the 100 Years' War, right, to find, in fact, probably a moment in which a French civil war would break out at this scale. There was also some hesitation, for sure, at shedding nobiliar blood to some extent. It's always a bit too ideally chivalrically ideal, so to say. There was, however, a sense that this was a sort of point of non-return. The Battle of Dreux, it's not like, as we've seen during the season, there hadn't been pretty upsetting events, but let's say this is the major engagement, the first major engagement of the war. However, the more plausible explanation seems that neither commander wished to relinquish a tactical advantage, with Montmorency wary of the Huguenots' cavalry superiority, and Condé cautious of the Catholic artillery's range. As we've seen, artillery was not really too much, but it could disrupt the advance of, in fact, the attackers here, because, as we've seen, the Catholics were basically sitting there. It's either, you try to break through or we won in a strategic sense. There was, however, also a difficulty, considering the Catholic army was larger and especially deployed in a line, so in width, to coordinate an attack across the entire formation with such large numbers of cavalry and therefore mobility from the Huguenot side. The greatest challenge was placed, however, on the Protestants because, of course, the offender does have the extremely important advantage of the initiative, choosing where to strike, how, but at the same time has to summon and harness much greater qualities in order to carry out this, in fact, weaker type of war, as von Clausewitz describes, in fact, regardless of the positive aim. Right? François de Lannoy, as we've seen, a Huguenot captain and chronicler, drew on his experience in regional skirmishes to document the war's moral and tactical complexities influencing Protestant strategy. The battle commenced when Huguenot cavalry units appeared and were fired upon by Catholic artillery. At this time, in the art of war, artillery was placed literally in the front of the entire host, because even if the crews could abandon it during the clashes, it was so heavy that it was practically impossible in a coordinated fashion to simply remove it from the field, and at some point the crews could come back using it. In fact, the backs and forths that regularly occurred in these clashes. We'll see this battle is quite complex to follow. And the Catholic artillery firepower prompted the Protestant to briefly retreat. Their cavalry units, they have greater mobility, they can test the enemy defenses, that's what's going on. Condé, believing the Catholics would not attack, and rightly so, ordered his army to bypass the Catholic position by crossing the river Blaise at Dreux, with their baggage and most artillery, including 3 heavy cannons, moving in that direction. As the Huguenots began to march west in battle order to outflank the Catholic line, however, advanced to catch them on their exposed flank, exploiting a gap in the Huguenot formation caused by their hasty realignment, prompting Condé to countermand his orders and launch a general attack instead along the broader lines that you see also represented in the map. So the battle unfolded in 4 distinct phases. The sources are quite sort of categorical about this, and or at least they simplify for the sake of military logic the engagement, that however makes sense the way it is described. So in the first phase, Coligny's cavalry charged Montmorency's left wing, swiftly routing the gendarmes and Sansac chevaux légers, the lighter cavalry. In fact, Vaux's lighter armor offered little protection against Reiter pistols. Right? Remember that in Renaissance warfare, of course, there is a great deal of armor that we can appreciate still, but most troops, including mounted ones, were largely unarmored, or at least they had pretty light armor. Also in this context, as we've seen, is sort of nobilitarily more loaded, more knightly, more feudal still. Montmorency, aged 69 at this point, was unhorsed, lightly wounded by a cutelasse and pistol shot to the face, and captured, in fact narrowly escaping execution by Protestant German mercenaries who were restrained by Coligny's own orders to prioritize noble prisoners for ransom. This was a big deal because essentially the commander-in-chief of the army, even though he wasn't the genial military mastermind behind this, was captured in the first action. You want to appreciate, however, the fact that these men would take the field even in their late 60s, which at the time was a bit more in comparison to 69 years old today. Coligny's horsemen continued to advance, by the way, cutting through the Catholic light horse and French regulars. We're talking infantry as well, capturing, in fact, most of the enemy artillery along the way before pursuing the fleeing Catholics toward their baggage train, which they looted, seizing supplies and silver plate valued at 20,000 écus. This is also very normal in battles, like the fact that here, especially here with a linear formation, basically, that different sections would be at some point broken, and that especially lighter cavalry would take the chance to loot, also often without express orders, actually countervening this military discipline to enrich themselves with what they could bring away here. There are battles like this one, for example, in which the camp of the winner is looted during the battle. And in fact, it's as if, exactly this critical moment was exploited by those rogues that really just wanted to prey on the enemy camp without caring too much about the outcome of the battle. Think about the famous notion of the Venetian Albanian stratiots at the Battle of Fornovo that would have not, in fact, finally engaged the French from the side because we're sort of involved in looting their camp. Meanwhile, Condé's wing, so we are on the other side. Here we say wing, it's mostly just basically half of the army, because that's also a formation, including 2 companies of Reiter, his Landsknechten, and 60 lances of gendarmes under La Rochefoucauld, targeted this Swiss pike block in the Catholic center. The reason why the left Protestant wing, you see it from the picture, engages the Catholic center is twofold. First of all, they're less, so they can't properly engage the rest of the enemy array. And at the center of the Catholic line, you see the Swiss pike block. That is essentially the most important unit here. If you break those, the Catholics do not have quite much to withstand the might of the Protestant cavalry. All right. But of course, you don't simply break through a Swiss pike block. Though initially repulsed by the Swiss disciplined volley of arquebus fire, the collapse of Montmorency's wing exposed the Swiss flank itself, subjecting them to relentless pistol fire from Reiter and charges by Huguenot gendarmes. This is again normal. The notion that the horses do not charge into the pikes is an enormous pile of BS. They constantly did so. They were trained exclusively to do so because this was basically almost the only type of heavy infantry they would encounter at this point in history, and this was the case since ever. It's about the cohesion of the battle formation, and cavalry hits hard. So it's not easy for the Swiss, but it's not easy at all. It's much worse actually for the Huguenots. In fact, despite heavy casualties, including 300 soldiers and 21 officers in the first ranks, the Swiss held firm in a massive square, 5,000 to 6,000 men, as we've seen. Their steadfast resistance, bolstered by rigorous training under their cantonal system, preventing a Catholic rout at this very moment. Gebhard Tammann, the Swiss colonel, was a veteran of mercenary campaigns across Europe, enforcing strict discipline that maintained the pike square's cohesion under such an intense pressure and on different flanks. You see, by the way, we talk of squares, but it's not like there was actually a front, like there weren't just, literal squares on the battlefields. Everything was also modulated according to circumstance. Besides, again, in this second half of the 17th century, things are evolving, of the 16th century like this one, are evolving towards a more linear direction already, right? You would think it's actually the end of the 17th. No, it's actually already from this point. Like the peak of the pike, so to say, is exactly the mid-16th century. And that's when the Reiter were so important, because they didn't have many other options but skirmishing in order to eventually to soften up the enemy lines enough to break through them. In the second phase, the Swiss bore the brunt of repeated Huguenot assaults. Condé's Landsknechten, spurred by rivalry with the Swiss and fueled by religious zeal, at this point attacked, trying to sort of break the Swiss formation, but were easily repulsed by the Swiss, retreating to barricade themselves in Blainville, where they fortified houses with makeshift defenses. This was perhaps an important tactical mistake. I mean, not having had the Landsknechten advance here, of course, I don't pretend to know better what was the commanders of what was happening in the field. It's likely that the Landsknechten were, as we've seen before, so were probably lesser in number, and so they would have not withstood, in fact, the Swiss counterattack or response had the latter not been adequately softened up, like even now, like, where they still, the Swiss still managed to repulse them. However, it's likely that at that point the same French cavalry would have intervened, and at that point the Royal Cavalry would have intervened, and the Protestants could have basically outflanked it and caused some greater havoc on that side of the French formation. We don't better know. In any case, consider also for the rest of Huguenot infantry that, as we've seen, was not particularly high performing, to see the best of their German mercenaries being repelled by such a battered Swiss soldiery. That's something that really makes chills run down your spine, considering what those foes are made of. And this is a great sort of satisfaction for the Swiss against their atavic enemies, the Landsknechten. In the meanwhile, Danville's gendarmes attempted to support the Swiss, but were overwhelmed by Condé's reiters, whose caracole tactics, firing pistols in successive ranks, as we've seen, disrupted their cohesion, forcing a retreat towards Guise's reserve. And this had happened even after Condé's reiter had been spent. That's why before I said, imagine if, say, this Landsknechten had just been sent out there as a bait and maybe butchered as a consequence, but also with the greater pressure of the more orderly army, Protestant army to back them up. It could have gone differently. It's just like inverting the thing, and maybe it would have gone even worse. But remember that Huguenot cavalry was best, and so simply using them against the Swiss pikes like that, at this point in history, perhaps it's not 100% what you want to do. Yes, you want to soften those guys up, that's how you should do, but if, again, the Swiss are simply isolated, they're deprived of any other support around, at that point they will have to retreat themselves or fighting to the death in a lost battle. The Huguenot cavalry flushed with success at this point, in fact, pursuing retreating Catholics and looting their baggage train at Neusemont. We are essentially on the right flank of the right section, probably of the Catholic formation, leaving, by the way, their infantry unsupported and vulnerable to counterattacks. We will see now what happens, because the infantry, including the Swiss, and not only, because there were also good French national infantrymen there, will have a pretty crucial role in the following phases. The third phase saw Guise and Saint-André, who had held back, advance with fresh troops from the Catholic right wing, including the Spanish Tercio, whose arquebusiers delivered devastating volleys on the incoming Huguenots. This is particularly relevant because, as we said before, the Huguenots had not managed to cover the entire enemy array. It was too wide, the enemy was too numerous, and Saint-André and Guise realized that they are the only unengaged section of the line. They have to intervene to essentially outflank or at least push back the Huguenots. In fact, this advance, this is a quite thoroughly combined army. There are cavalrymen, pikemen, arquebusiers, as we've just seen with the Tercio. It swept aside the poorly armed Huguenot French infantry in particular. They knew essentially where to shoot into. The Huguenots lacked sufficient pikemen to counter the Catholic advance, and the remaining Landsknechten retreated at this point without even engaging in battle. Some had remained in the rear lines. You can more or less see it. The map is recreated on the basis of, say, more or less the overall engagements, following the dynamics, not literally a satellite view of what actually happened everywhere, right? In any case, it's basically what went on in a schematic fashion. Many Huguenots deserted to nearby villages as well. Presumably some of them would have come from there as well. Condé, attempting to rally his fleeing forces at this point, was captured himself by a French noble, Gabriel de Lorge, after his horse was shot out from under him. Gabriel de Lorge was just a minor Catholic noble, however loyal to the Guise faction. He earned prominence for capturing the enemy commander at this point, bolstering his family's standing in royal circles. That's the backbone of we made some videos of this, like the small nobility, in particular in France, but this was more or less, especially at this point, the general case for everywhere in Europe, that regardless of pike-and-shot warfare, actually still constituted the very backbone of the broader moral force of these armies. They were the guys providing with the officialty that invested money to probably into their units that they were commissioned to. I made an entire video about this, probably for the French army, and the importance of the small aristocracy up to, in fact, the French Revolution, in part even beyond, in the royal army, and the remainder of the same later on. The Protestant cavalry, by the way, exhausted after hours of combat and low on ammo, began retreating in good order. You see in perspective why that notion of maybe if we had sent, the infantry just to be butchered, maybe the cavalry could have countered the Catholic movements, could have at least remained fresh, and at that point overrun the same cavalry. So this may be in a broader horizon, at least the alternative that the Protestants had, instead of concentrating their best cavalry chiefly against the Swiss that could be somehow just isolated on the battlefield and not given even a chance to engage at some point, taking out all the rest of the troops. At this juncture, Saint-André was also captured and killed by enemies holding a grudge. This tells you the degree of brutality already existing in the French wars of religion in general, temper of the time. These were the killers were likely Huguenot retainers avenging earlier Catholic atrocities, and Guise narrowly escaped when his horse stumbled but was rescued by his personal guard. Saint-André's death, possibly by retainers linked to Huguenot nobles he had persecuted, underscored the personal vendettas driving the war. In the fourth phase, as dusk fell, because they had been fighting all afternoon basically, Coligny relied approximately 1,300 French and German cavalry behind the woods near Blainville and launched a counterattack. The Protestants had held some reserves back. Some troops from those very rare positions, as we've seen, had already fled, but it was believed fundamentally that holding this specific position at Blainville and contending this town, because the battle was fought also across the villages that we described before, would allow for at least some other tactical opportunities. And in fact, this move briefly threatened to reverse Catholic gains, as the remaining few hundred cavalry at that point were unprepared after having been depleted by earlier routes, remember, plus combat, so they were also tired. Guise had positioned, however, a veteran French infantry regiment under Martigues in a square south of Blainville, naturally foreseeing a possible Huguenot coming back. This force was in fact the one successfully repelling the Huguenots with disciplined arquebus fire, killing or wounding 200 riders of the enemy. Martigues was a seasoned Catholic commander with experience in the Italian wars and was chosen by Guise exactly for his proven ability to hold defensive lines under pressure. Unable to break the pikemen with spent lances and facing darkness, Coligny ordered a retreat southward covered by his cavalry, leaving the field to the Catholics without pursuit, as Guise's forces were too disorganized to capitalize on their victory. When you look at it, the battle was among the bloodiest of the period, with 8,000 to 10,000 killed or wounded from the 30,000 engaged. Catholic losses included at least 3,000 infantry, notably 1,000 Swiss with their Colonel Gebhard Tammann himself, and 1,000 cavalry, disproportionately affecting the French nobility during the course of the war, including Saint-André, Francis II, Duke of Nevers, that was killed by a stray arquebus shot, as a matter of fact, and Gabriel de Montmorency, slain during the initial rout. Francis II, Duke of Nevers, was a prominent Catholic noble with ties to the royal court, and he died so unexpectedly, weakening the triumvirate's noble support base as well. Gabriel de Montmorency, as we've seen, was a relative of the constable, a young noble whose death further eroded at least Montmorency's familial influence. Huguenot losses were estimated at 140 cavalry, 2,200 infantry, and 1,500 Landsknechten who surrendered, though Catholic sources claimed up to 6,000 total Protestant losses, likely inflated to bolster morale. The battlefield, as described by the most famous surgeon Ambroise Paré, was strewn with bodies over a league, with many wounded succumbing to shock and cold during the bitterly cold night. We are almost at the end of the year, recalled by trooper Jean de Mergez as the coldest he ever experienced, with temperatures dropping to below 10 degrees Celsius, causing frostbite among survivors as well. So it was an incredibly brutal clash. It gives you an idea of sort of this grim northern French landscape covered in bodies, dying people, like hearing the laments, pieces of people destroyed, towns. This is really terrifying, the sight of the battle after the bloodbath. And Ambroise Paré is definitely a witness of excellence. That he first of all, he served as a surgeon at multiple battles, and the better school for a surgeon is war. This is known since antiquity as an adage. He provided this critical medical insight that shaped also post-battle care. I made a video years ago. I haven't re-uploaded that with updated pictures, but in any case, the capacities of the time were very limited, especially against infection, etc. But otherwise, orthopedy, surgery, to an extent, were quite advanced. Jean de Merger was instead a Huguenot trooper with experience in regional uprisings, offering first-hand accounts of the battle's harsh conditions as well. Despite the Catholic victory, Guise, now in sole command following Saint-André's death and Montmorency's capture, did not pursue Coligny's retreating forces, as his army lacked the supplies and cohesion for a prolonged chase of that kind. Instead, he reorganized the battered Catholic army and, after nearly 7 weeks, initiated the siege of Orléans. The Huguenot stronghold on the Loire, formidable political, strategic, also symbolical center, because, as you know, this had been the place from which the French had come back to victory in the 100 Years' War. It was historically a royal center. We are seeing here Guise's exploit from February the 5th to March the 12th, 1563, employing 1,200 troops and 20 heavy cannons against Orléans. Condé, at that point treated with chivalric courtesy, shared Guise's bed in a Nuisemont Grange, reflecting the era's ideals of noble honor, as both men adhere to a code of conduct rooted in medieval traditions of warfare. Condé had been captured and naturally had been treated with dignity, with respect. Coligny, meanwhile, led the remaining Huguenot forces to Normandy, reestablishing control over key towns like Caen and Dieppe, and linking with English allies at Le Havre, who provided 3,000 additional troops and naval support. You see, this is a bit the problem of the French wars of religion. The revolts can always be rekindled and reactivated, even just with a few thousands of men, that across the very big fronts, which is a disadvantage to an extent, regardless of the actual easy governability, especially of the northeast, create problems to the crown. Andelot organized Orléans' defense, bolstered by surviving Protestant infantry and cavalry, fortifying the city with earthworks and stockpiling provisions for a prolonged siege. Andelot, Coligny's younger brother and a committed Protestant since the 50s of the 16th century, used his organizational skills honed in regional campaigns to fortify Orléans, rallying local Huguenot militias. The battle's political consequences were significant. The Catholic victory disrupted Catherine de' Medici's hopes for a negotiated settlement, as Guise's unchallenged command intensified the war effort, backed by papal subsidies of 100,000 écus. By the way, we've seen there is also a partial Spanish backing. Spain did not want France to be too powerful, but also did not want to crumble, especially to Protestant forces at that point, would have all burdened largely on the Habsburgic power in Europe, in a pretty delicate situation already. We've sort of looked at these years also in different other parts of Europe and how the whole thing was difficult, how big this French confessional clash really was. The papacy was obviously boosting French power as much as possible, so to crush the Protestant heresy. However, Guise's assassination on February 24, 1563, during the very siege of Orléans by a Huguenot fanatic, Jean-Paul Dreux de Marais, coupled with Saint-André's death and Montmorency captivity, dismantled the triumvirate we enucleated at the beginning of the video, strengthening Catherine's position as a regent. However, Jean-Paul Dreux de Marais was a low-born Huguenot radicalized by Catholic persecutions, acting alone, but his act reflected the growing extremism among Protestant factions, especially at this point under the full, let's say at least probably the onslaught of the Catholic coming back. Catherine mediated the Edict of Amboise on March the 19th, 1563, granting limited toleration for Huguenot worship in order to reduce the pressure on the heavily strained royal coffers. This tolerance was naturally granted primarily to noblemen. It wasn't much just understood for the rest of the estates. This was essentially allowing private worship in noble households, but restricting public services to designated towns only. This fragile truce, alongside joint efforts to expel the English from Le Havre without Coligny's direct participation, as he distrusted Catherine's motives, temporarily halted hostilities. However, the edict's limitations, which excluded urban worship for most Huguenots, and ongoing political intrigues around the crown, particularly tensions between Catherine and Guise family, precipitated a second war 4 years later in 1567. As we've seen, that there is a lot of intermittence here. And in fact, it's not even like the age of the wars of religion in France is something ending just in a few decades. It's something that will protract itself also well into the 17th century. The Battle of Dreux yielded critical military lessons. The Swiss infantry's resilience, first of all, despite heavy losses, reinforced the Reichsläufer's value to the royal army, which continued to employ them throughout the wars, with Swiss cantons supplying over 20,000 troops to France by 1580, thereby continuing a tradition as old as the 15th century. Conversely, both sides deemed German Landsknechten ineffective in open battle due to their susceptibility to cavalry charges. This is quite relevant because, as we've seen in the video about the Landsknechten, by the end of the 16th century, these forces had lost much of their initial ethos for different reasons that are specific of sort of the general imperial social situation in Germany. It's a bit too complicated now to digress on that, but let's say there had been some sort of, by the early 16th century, of tail strike of the great peasant movements. The Habsburgs, in a moment of sort of happy conjunction, had successfully managed to hire lots of these foretestators, and giving them almost a sense, especially in a German souls of sort of Cingulum bearing, some sort of almost knighted order. However, the Landsknechten were prey of their own corruption, of their own unions, so to say, because they literally had something like that, and they were very innovative in that fashion, but they soon collapsed as an effective fighting force by the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. Conversely, the Swiss here still wouldn't. Technically, they will also decline. It's not like the time of the Swiss had sort of passed. The Landsknechten actually had lasted in a more conventional sense, at least longer chronologically compared to the Swiss decline. In fact, if you look at it, the Landsknechten versatility proved useful in later sieges, such as at the same Orléans, where they excelled in sapping operations. So in other words, they weren't much of the sort of pike block thing that they were, to an extent, conceived for, but they were good professional soldiery that could go around for all seasons, so to say. But what is even more fascinating, as we pointed out, is the importance of heavy cavalry on French battlefields in what should have been the moment of peak of pike-and-shot warfare, and so the minimum of cavalry force. The effectiveness, however, of cavalry stems particularly from the pistol-armed German Reiter, whose caracole tactics could deliver up to 10,000 shots per hour from a 10,000-man unit. Not even too much if you think about it. But still an important level of firepower concentration in relative terms, especially if acting in column, as we've seen at Dreux. The scoring the Reiter battle dominance, prompting both sides to prioritize cavalry over infantry in subsequent campaigns, also because things were dragging on tremendously, and the big clumsy formations of pike men were incredibly expensive. So paradoxically, it's a bit like during the 100 Years' War, the English chevauchée, there is a lot of mounted ward war, so to say, and things change a little also all throughout. From a speaking of the art of war, we pass from sort of, especially also an increased firepower in many circumstances, as opposed to the stopping power of the pike. However, heavy infantry will actually consolidate at some point. Right, we've seen also the performance of the French infantry at the Battle of Freiburg at the end of the 30 Years' War, something utterly shocking. Honestly, the level of losses they were able to take to successfully storm enemy position. I really advise you to listen to that video because it's very beautiful. Now, Coligny's echelon attack, staggering cavalry charges to maintain momentum, demonstrated the advantage of layered assaults as well. At least here it was just a necessity, right? Testing the enemy line to see what they could break through, while Guise's timely reserve deployment proved decisive in stabilizing the Catholic force. Catalan line in general still was maintained. Naturally, as we explained, great part of how the battle unfolded was, say, pre-planned, or at least it was visually okay. Like, there is basically a chunk of the army that has attacked a chunk and the rest the other, right? So the Catholics are favored by their numerical superiority and also their linear formation for actual flexibility and mobility, paradoxically. Because if you think about it, since the enemy was attacking and especially deeper formations, the point was risking even a wider formation because this is thinner and can be broken by the column. However, there is a veritable flexibility because of actually a pretty solid capacity of infantry as well. That is showed by the royalists that are, in a sense, also better armed, better organized, and so on. They can afford that. And also an important degree of cavalry and firepower from the royal side. This was the most complete host. There is no doubt about that. So we see the tercio arquebusiers, for example, that are probably the one who take out the same Reiter at the end of the battle. So it's intense. We will never fully know what happened, but you can imagine more or less how this stuff unfolded. The battle also highlighted the risks of commanders leading from the front, as Condé, Montmorency, and Saint-André's involvement led to their capture or death, as we've seen, limiting their control over large formations and causing command confusion. The Catholics lost important commanders. The inability of cavalry to break disciplined infantry is exemplified here in particular by the Swiss square, because likely not even the best of the French national infantry, regardless of their capacity to withstand the last Reiter attack, Blainville at the end of the battle, would have happened without the Swiss. If they had been properly in their place before, under the thickly concentrated enemy fire coming and charges coming alternated from also multiple fronts. The Swiss square withstood over 20 charges, because that's also how the combat happens. Not a single wave; it's just repeating over and over again. And think about even how, of course, the number of charges here is facilitated by the fact that the Reiter were enacting mostly skirmishing tactics, but some of these were actual crushing charges into the enemy pikes. Also think about the psychological impact the French elites slaughtering each other at this point. It signals to the country that there is something deeply broken in this, and war is going to come again. There is a lot to do to fix this, and it's not going to be anytime soon. At the Battle of Dreux, 500 noblemen died, further shaping military thinking in a broader socio-cultural sense. What was this war about, right? Why would confessional wars being fought? Of course, there were many concrete contingental political calculations, as we've seen the same siding of the nobility. Wasn't much. It's not like it's difficult to say like this guy did it just because of convenience or he didn't believe her, but everything was also very much on the line as much as the war, right? The France here was not a random country in a broader religious balance of Europe, and so there was so much at stake in a broader universal sense here. The narrow Catholic victory reinforced the crown's caution towards pitched battles, deemed costly and risky. Mostly, it was just the financial cost. This wasn't even a decisive victory in the sense that the war didn't simply end there. So yielding strategic gains was something different, especially against the slow follow-ups against Protestant strongholds. We've seen how everybody says, oh my God, the Middle Ages were dominated by siege war. I mean, even in the series about Marlborough, do you realize how impacting siege warfare was up to the mid-18th century? Protestant strongholds, even in Orléans, is a big French city. And again, there are these massive sieges, which absolutely massive. I never really heard anything about the sieges of the French Wars of Religion, because these were staggering, massive, big, important. They were what also mostly oriented the strategic axioms here. I think I've never seen a single video about that. Can do it. Needless to say, these lessons influenced French military strategy and also the European ones as a consequence. Again, the myth that most things were being observed, I don't know, in the Netherlands and some other... No, right? What was happening in France was a big deal, was way more important at the time. And it would remain for the next 14 years of the wars, so-called wars of religion, that again didn't even simply end there. Shaping tactics at battles that we will surely see at some point, hopefully like Jarnac in 1569, Moncontour in the same year. So, again, very interesting scenario. French warfare from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century is actually amazing, or at least it's so underrated that even if it is beautiful as any fantastic scenario here, that for us as passionate about military history, is definitely something even worthier to be covered, because probably nobody else is really doing it at any point. And we have here also the 21st video about modern French warfare, which is not even that much, because French warfare in this era is enormous. We should probably make our entire channel about it to an extent. We will extend to lots of other. Again, we have a pretty hefty modern warfare playlist. I think 100, 200 or something videos here, and 181. This is 182nd. But anyway, it's a lot, right? But we have covered this mostly in, I can say generic terms, but terms that weren't necessarily covering the entire picture the way we could have, right? And so, especially in an evidential campaign-based fashion. So again, second video we make about the French Wars of Religion. We're surely going to expand on them and to look at all a series of pretty interesting things that at some point we shouldn't give for granted, especially 16th century warfare. We didn't make so much, and instead it's so relevant, so important, and a battle like the one of Dreux really signaling it, to say the least. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.